Thank you so much for joining us on this Tisha B'Av. I'm Dr. Shira Weiss of the Sacks-Herenstein Center, and I'm honored to be joining conversation with Dr. Yael Ziegler on her book on Eikha. Dr. Ziegler is the director of the Matan Kitvuni program and assistant professor of Tanakh at Herzog College. She's lectured extensively on a wide range of biblical topics in Israel, the US, Canada, South Africa, Australia, and Europe. Dr. Ziegler is the author of Promises to Keep, The Oath in Biblical Narrative, as well as Ruth, From Alienation to Monarchy, and the book that we're talking about today, Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World. And she's currently working on a forthcoming book on Sefer Shemot. Dr. Ziegler, thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Shira, for having me.
I used to struggle to connect with Megillat Eikha, which recounted destruction so far back in history. And similarly, it was difficult for me at the Pesach Seder to really kind of fulfill the obligation of recounting the Exodus as if I was there. But in the past few years, unfortunately, V'hi She'amda and Shvo Chamatcha L'Goyim have had all new relevance. And similarly, the keynote that we recited last night and today have very recent resonance. Oy Mahaya Lanu, that we said last night. Oh, what has befallen us. We read the elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart has ceased. Alas, our dancing has been turned into mourning. And in Megillat Eikha, in the third chapter, in Ani HaGever, the Megillah writes, He's placed me in darkness like the eternally dead. He's walled me up so I cannot escape. He's weighed me down with chains. It's hard not to conjure up those recent brutal images of the hostages. So Yael, how has Keynote and how has Eikha taken on new meaning for you in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we have a very long-standing tradition that when we read Eikha, when we read the keynote, so we always plug into other tragedies. This is true in the Midrash Eikha, right? That the Midrash Eikha refers to not just the first destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but also the events of the second destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the events of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the keynote reflect that as well, right? And it was throughout the keynote we talk about different events in Jewish history. And I mean, I don't know exactly what is going on in different shuls around the world, but we said several keynote last night and this morning that directly related to the events of October 7th. Rev Rimon, who is the Rev of our shul, wrote a stunning kina, which he actually wrote last year for October 7th, but he added in several paragraphs that included some of the, I would say, even more uplifting events of this year, which makes this year, I would say, a little bit different than last year. Again, Shira, you're right. We still have those images of the hostages, and we're still in the throes of war. And so, it's not that the situation doesn't still feel, when we're reading Eikha, it still feels very heavy, but certainly we're experiencing Eikha through the lenses of October 7th. And you cited several psukim. I could add to that several more psukim that I think resonated greatly with me. Olileha halchu shvi lifnei tsar, right? Her young children went into captivity before the enemy. Even, psukim that really enable us to kind of summon the boldness to question and turn to God with certain questions. Re'eh Hashem v'habita, l'mi olaltako, right? Look out and see, to whom have you done this? Some of the descriptions of enemies. Patzu aleinu, patzu alayich pihem kol oivayich. Sharku vayacharku shen, right? They open their mouth at you. They gnash their teeth at you. They say, oh, this is the day that we have been hoping for. This is the day that we have been waiting for. It brings to mind some of those images of celebrating, some of our enemies celebrating October 7th and the aftermath. And these psukim, they resonate differently, right? They just create for us, I think, a little bit of a different experience, really throughout the Megillah. And every time I read the Megillah, new psukim, I think, kind of have that impact, which I'm sure is true for everybody who's hearing Megillat Eikha. But I mean, I think it's not just the psukim themselves that we are meant to internalize as we experience our own national calamity. And that's, I think, one of the things that Eikha is designed to do, is to give us the tools to experience national calamity. And one of the things that I think that we learned from Eikha is that we're not meant to let a crisis go to waste. We're meant to use it to shape who we are, to shape who we are as individuals, to shape who we are as a community. Catastrophic events are opportunities for introspection and for change. I think certainly, where I am in Israeli society, I think we still feel that there is a lot of work to be done on a societal level. And, Echa it directs us to pay attention to that as well. The book teaches us to mourn. It teaches us that mourning is important, that it's part of the human condition. And at the same time, it teaches us to remember our blessings, to understand the enormity of our loss, and to try to put the pieces back together again so that we can use these events in order to be better. I mean, I think even certainly in our relationship with each other, but I think also in our relationship with God. Eikha has a lot of boldness, and I think it also teaches us, and it gives us the right and the almost the directive to turn to God boldly. So I know I said a lot of different things here, but I think that all of these things that I've always thought about Eikha suddenly become, I think, just really that much more poignant and relevant.
I can attest that Rav Rimon's Kina was said in my shul, and I hope it was said very widely throughout the U.S. and the rest of the world. I want to follow up on a bunch of the points that you just made, but first I want to start out on kind of more meta level. In your book, you discuss the structure of the 5 chapters of Megillat Eikha, and you cite David Raymer's approach that the chapters progress alongside the 5 psychological stages of grief, starting with denial or isolation, then anger, then bargaining, then depression, and ultimately acceptance. Can you show how the Megillah conveys that arc?
Yeah, I will just start out just with a short apology. I thought to myself, don't drink when you're on the Zoom with all of these
Go
people who
for
are
it. No, go for it.
of the fast, but I apologize. We only broke our fast, 45 minutes ago. So, in any case, yeah, so the Megillah, I think, has a linear progression. Now, I'm actually more drawn. I think it has several different structures. We'll be talking about the other one, I think, also in the course of our discussion tonight. But, it has a cyclical structure, which I'm drawn to, but it also seems to progress. I'll just mention one sort of obvious indication of the progression, which is that as the chapters progress, they start to get shorter. Right. So the chapters 1, 2, and 3 are actually exactly equal length. Everybody thinks that chapter 3 is longer because
Yeah.
it has 3 times the amount of
Yeah.
verses, but each verse is only 1 sentence. And in chapters 1 and 2, each verse is 3 sentences. So actually, in terms of the amount of words, it's remarkably similar. So they're very equal lengths. Chapter 4 is 2/3 the length of chapters 1 through 3, and chapter 5 is 1/3 the length. So you almost feel as though maybe even the book is running out of steam, which I think it is. In other words, there's a sense of almost settling into the new situation, for better and for worse. So we do have this sense that there is a progression. I would also mention one other indication of progression before I talk about the theory that you had mentioned, and that is that both in chapters 4 and 5, there's a lot more of a sense that we're moving towards hope and some kind of resolution that this is not final, that we're going to be able to emerge from this, which you don't really see in the first 3 chapters as much. So there does seem to be a progression, and for that reason some scholars have looked for a linear progression. Now, as you mentioned, David Reimer tries to apply Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of mourning to the 5 chapters. I'm somewhat resistant to this because I think anytime you take, some kind of psychological theory and try to put it on a biblical text, you don't want to try to put a square peg into a round. I don't know if that's the right expression, right? But you want to try to see the biblical text for what it is, which is not a psychological treatise. On the other hand, I think that the point is an important point, because what Megillat Eikha is trying to do is to kind of walk with us through the stages of contending with this calamitous and event. So he claims that the first stage, the first stage is denial. Denial. So look, the 5 stages of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross that she finds have to do with patients being told that they're dying, right? And that's also not entirely analogous to our situation. But what happens in the first stage is that in order to maintain this denial, you have to be isolated from others. And certainly, even though I don't see very much denial in chapter 1, nor does David Reimer, right? There is a very, very, very strong theme of isolation, of Jerusalem kind of hunkering down into its solitary position, into its isolated position, and that does seem to cohere with something very central in the theory. Chapter 2. It certainly aligns with the second stage, which is anger. Chapter 2 is a very angry chapter. It describes, first of all, mostly God's anger, right? But the chapter itself, the way it's constructed, the kind of language that is used, the images that emerge show that the viewpoint is an angry viewpoint. It's not just God's anger; it's also human anger. Chapter 3 is interesting because the third stage is bargaining. Right? It's when you try to bargain with God and to kind of say, "I'll be better, just let me survive," right? And actually, in the middle of chapter 3, we are going to speak about the middle of chapter 3, because you can't speak about Eikha without speaking about the middle of chapter 3. And the middle of chapter 3 represents really the only kind of theological treatise in the book, right? And so what David Reimer says is, well, that section is kind of the author of Eikha saying, I'm going to be good. I'm going to reconnect with God, and then things will be okay. Chapter 4 is depression. Certainly chapter 4 is depression, right? I mean, there's almost this kind of dulling of the senses as chapter 4 recounts the terrible effects of the famine, the terrible effects of the destruction of Yerushalayim, and there's almost this kind of disconnect between the horror that's being described and the kind of matter-of-fact way that it's described. It feels very dull. Now, what's most interesting, I think, about the way that David Reimer applies this theory is that he claims that the 5th stage, which is acceptance, is not found in chapter 5, and that's because Yerushalayim refuses to die. So I don't know if I don't know how much I buy the application of the theory, but I really enjoyed the fact that he was willing to deviate from the ending of the theory in order to say, look, the story of Yerushalayim is not the story of someone who has found out that he's has a fatal illness and has to prepare himself to accept that, because at the end of the Yerushalayim story there is hope that Yerushalayim will not just hope, there is certainty that Yerushalayim will be revived, and that's the continuation of the Tanakh, which is of course Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, the return to Yerushalayim.
I want to talk about that hope in a little bit, but before that, I want to talk about a couple of the points you've made previously. I published a book a few years ago on protests against God in the book of Job, where I discussed Judaism's dual tradition of pro-protest and anti-protest theologies. How Job, on the one hand, maintained his integrity by being morally indignant about his unjustified suffering and protested against God, versus his resignation and his acquiescence that humanity can't understand God's ways. And similarly, regarding Eikha, you discuss how the structure of the Megillah reflects this theological complexity. One approach portrays humans coming to terms with God's actions and acknowledging that they're justified, and the other in which humans resist that kind of reconciliation and they maintain a defiant posture of incomprehensibility and outrage. So can you explain how you see that tension in the Megillah and the theological lessons of God's role in human suffering?
Yeah, well, first let me say I love that. I'm going to have to get a hold of your book. But one of the beautiful and important things in learning Tanakh is that Tanakh is just so real, right? And in being real, it is very complex. Right? It doesn't offer these simplistic reductionist answers to anything. I mean, I think that this is something that I think all of us should take a lesson from, right? If human beings are going to deal with calamity, they're going to have to deal with it in many different ways, and especially in terms of our relationship with God, especially in terms of theology, right? How do we contend with God's role in human suffering, and particularly when human suffering has to do with the nation, right? When the entire nation is experiencing something. So what I think we talked before about the linear progression in Eikha, and I said that I'm more drawn to the kind of circular structure of Eikha, and that's where I think you're going to find the theology. So that the way that I see Eicha's 5 chapters is that they're kind of they're structured as rings, right? So that chapters 1 and 5 are very similar, and that creates the kind of outermost ring of the book. It's the periphery of the book. Chapters 2 and 4 are very similar chapters, and that's kind of an inner ring. And what we're going to talk about shortly is chapter 3, which doesn't have a counterpart. It's really the kind of standalone core of the book. But for the moment, we won't talk about the middle of the book. The 2 rings are very interesting because they're very, very, very similar linguistically. There's language that is shared between those chapters that appears nowhere else in the book. So for example, in chapters 1 and 5, you have the word ke'almana, like a widow. We have other words that are shared and phrases. Libi davai, my heart is miserable, appears in those 2 chapters. And the tone of those chapters is very similar. They're kind of lonely, empty, eerie chapters that describe more what is no longer than what actually, than describing the destruction. In contrast to that, chapters 2 and 4 are destructive chapters. They describe God's anger being poured out. They describe fire. They describe famine. They describe the death of children. They describe the horrific image of mothers eating their children in the throes of the terrible famine. So those chapters are deliberately being kind of mirrored to each other, both linguistically, thematically, and in terms of its tone. And what I think is happening there is that those chapters are being compared so that we'll note that those rings have very, very different theological approaches, right? So that chapters 1 and 5 kind of grope their way toward an admission of sinfulness, toward what we call theodicy, right? Tziduk hadin, justifying God, saying, well, it's true, bad things happened, but there's clearly a reason for it, and there's justice in it. Chet chata'a Yerushalayim al kain lenida hayata, right? Yerushalayim surely sinned. That's why all of this happened. Tzadiku Hashem kifihu mariti, right? God is just because I rebelled against His word, right? I'll call psha'ai because of all of my sins. And we have a similar thing that happens in chapter 5. Now, it doesn't happen easily, right? Admission of sinfulness is not something that people just sort of whip out and say, oh yeah, it must be I sinned. So, and it's really interesting what happens in chapter 5 in this regard, because in chapter 5, we kind of have in verse 7, we kind of have this pause where the people say, Avotenu chateu ve'enam va'anachnu avonotehem savalnu. Our forefathers sinned, and they are no longer, and we suffered their sins, right? Which suggests that they're not taking any responsibility for the events, and the events are not really justified. But by the time we get to verse 16, chapter 5 has sort of groped its way towards admission of sinfulness, and we hear the people say, Oy na lanu ki chatanu. Woe to us, for we have sinned. So, kind of what exists at the periphery of the book is a strong sense of justifying God and saying this situation, it makes sense. It had to happen. It was because human beings are weak and fallible and sinful. But what's most interesting, and for those people who that point is disturbing, that's okay, because it's disturbing in Eikha as well. In chapters 2 and 4, the reigning kind of theological approach is not tziduk hadin, it's not justifying, it's tzadik varalo. It's that, bad things are happening to innocent people. And the best kind of indication of that is the focus on the children in both chapters 2 and 4. Because when you see children who are suffering and children who are dying, it's very difficult to say, chatati aviti pashati, chatati lefanecha, right? Vasiti kach vekach. It's very difficult to engage in any sort of confession, because children dying is by definition something which is inexplicable. And what I think is kind of really important about these two different approaches, which really create the two rings in Eikha, is that we have to hold them in balance. They're both correct, but they're only correct when they're held in balance with each other, right? So that, I can't live in a world where I don't believe that God is just. We can't live in that kind of world. We have to believe that there is divine justice. But I don't always see it. And when I don't see it, what do? And Eikha says, you turn to God in anger, in confusion, with an accusatory question, right? Look out and see. To whom did you do this? Right? And those two, kind of poles, we're always balancing them. They are the great, I think, experience of our relationship with God, especially given that the human condition is suffering, right? As human beings, in the best case scenario, we bury, our parents, who are the people that brought us into this world. So, the notion that we as religious people have to figure out how to navigate our way in a world that is filled with human suffering, and our relationship with God in that world, I think is very clear cut. What Eikha gives us is, I think, a pretty complex, and I think almost very, very well developed, if you see it, approach to how to engage with God in different but balanced ways.
I want to come back to your points on theodicy and Tzadik Varalo in a bit, but first I want to delve deeper into an understanding of the central chapter, as you mentioned, Perek Gimel, Ani HaGever, and the ambiguous and the universal Gever, the person who's the subject of the chapter, who you depict as a Job-like figure. And you talk about his quest for shalom, but not just physical peace, but rather an inner tranquility, a sense of wholeness, which I think speaks very much to the feeling among Jews today. We quest for shalom, both physically, of course, but also spiritually. So how do you read that in light of the contemporary reality?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, Judaism always is in a quest for shalom, and we see it all everywhere, right? We end our tefillah, our shmona, sorry, we end with shalom. We end when we bench, when we say the grace after meals, we end with shalom. When the priests give us the priestly blessing, it leads to shalom. Actually, my youngest son, his name is Noam Shalom, and I didn't even realize. I mean, I guess I didn't know at the time he was going to be my youngest son, but right, that idea that we're moving towards this sense of whatever shalom means, completion, tranquility, inner and outer peace. It's very much, I think, a defining feature of what we're looking for. And in chapter 3, the Gever, who describes in the first 18 verses his terrible, relentless, unmitigated, and even inexplicable for him suffering. In that sense, he's a Job-like figure. And by the end, I think he finds his footing a little bit. But in verse 17 in chapter 3, he says, "Vatiznach mishalom nafshi, nashiti tova." He said, my soul rejected the idea of peace, right? I lost the possibility of finding good in my life, right? So that this notion that, I almost picture him at that point in the chapter, just, lying prone on the floor, not able to get up, right? Omar, what's the next pasuk? Omar, avad nitzchi v'tochalti me'Hashem. And I said, I have lost my strength. I've lost my hope in God. And that's it. We just kind of find him lying there. What is remarkable is how he pulls himself out of that place and he kind of gets back on his feet again. Now, the word shalom doesn't reappear here in this context. It's not as though he gets up and he says, "Oh, I found peace." But actually, one word that I think is quite interesting that does reappear when he pulls himself back up again is the word tov, right? He says, "Nashiti tova." I forgot what was good. And, chapter 3 is I think it's sort of the chapter that we focus on, and not just because it's the central chapter, but because the chapter actually is always sort of crying out, focus on me, right? One of the ways that it does it is by creating a triple acrostic, right? So that we have 66 verses. There are 22 letters in the alphabet. Aleph, 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 Bet, 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 Gimel, Gimel, Gimel. Why am I saying this? Because generally speaking, the chapter varies the words that are used in the 3 letters, right? So, Aleph will be Ani, Oti, and Ach, right? It doesn't use the same word. That would be, I think, kind of maybe uncreative or a little bit boring, right? But there are 2 letters of the entire alphabet that actually use the same word 3 times in a row. And not for lack of other words, but because they're trying to kind of emphasize and highlight that word. And one of them is tet. And the word that is used is tov, 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 3 times in a row, which is really right at the center. And also remarkably appears, just 7 or 8 verses after the Gever says, Nashiti Tova, I forgot what was good. And he reacquires, he finds good again. It's an interesting question, which I didn't really examine in my book, and it sort of only is coming up now in this exchange with you, as to why he doesn't reuse the word shalom. It's interesting.
Sequel.
That what?
You can use it in a sequel. You can write a sequel about it. The repetition of the word tov is really interesting, and as the chapter progresses, the Gever transforms, as you write, and hauls himself out of the depths of despair and recovers his optimism. How does he do that? And how do we do that? How does one find hope in the seemingly hopeless?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple things happen here that I think that are interesting. First of all, how he gets up off the ground again, right? Because he says, I have no tikva, right? I have no hope, I have no good, and I have no shalom, right? So how does he emerge from that? So, first of all, I think that he mentions for the first time in the entire chapter the word God in verse 18. Okay. Until now, he has been speaking about God because God is his tormentor, right? That Rashi says that very explicitly several times in the chapter. But, even in the first pasuk, Ani hagever ra'a oni b'shevet evrato. I am the man who has seen my affliction at the rod of his anger. And Rashi says, whose anger is that? Right? Who are we talking about? And Rashi says, Shel harodeh v'hamakeh hakadosh baruch hu. The one who is persecuting him and hitting him is God. Right? And Rashi says it again, actually, later on in the chapter. I think it's in verse 10. The chapter describes his tormentor as a dove orev hu li ari b'mistarim, right? He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in secret places. And, this notion of comparing God to a wild animal, an irrational wild animal who is attacking for no good reason, is extraordinarily problematic from a theological perspective. So Rashi says there, oh yeah, that's God. He's describing God, right? So God is in the hidden person throughout the beginning part of the chapter, but he actually doesn't mention God's name until verse 18. Va'omar avad nitzchi v'tochati mehashem. And as soon as he says the name of God, it's almost as though it wakes him up a little bit, right? He begins to think about God. It kind of sends him in this thoughtful direction. And what happens is, as we said, at the center of the book, he engages in this theological reflection. Now, the theological reflection is all of 19 sentences, right? It's not really well developed. It's not as protracted, certainly, as the book of Iyov, which you wrote about. But it kind of gives you, I think, guidelines for showing, I think, to answer your question, what enables him to kind of get to his feet again. And I'm going to say something I'll start with something structural, right, about those 19 verses. I think they need to be divided into 3 parts. Now, this is the center of the central book of Eikha, right? It's chapters 21 through 39 in the book. And I think they need to be divided into 3 parts. The first part, he is ruminating on God's ways, right? He says, Chaste Hashem, ki lo tamnu, ki lo chalu rachamav, chadashim la bikarim, rabba emunatecha. He's talking about the chesed of God, right? The kindness of God, the loyalty of God. They have not ceased. His compassions, they don't end. Even if today we don't see them, they renew themselves every morning. And God's faithfulness in bringing the world and those compassions and those kindnesses, that is an axiom of faith, right? The minute we start thinking about God, that kind of gives us the almost the buffer, right, to be able to get back on our feet again. Now, what happens in the third section of these ruminations, I'm skipping over the middle, right? The middle of the middle of the middle, right? What happens in this third section of the ruminations is he goes back to dwell on God again, right? And he says, Ki lo yiznach le'olam Hashem, right? God does not reject forever. Ki im hoga v'richam kerov chasadav. That even if he makes someone moan, he then has compassion because of the greatness of his kindnesses. So you know what we have on both sides? We have chesed v'rachamim and chesed v'rachamim. We have God's kindness and compassion on both sides. On both sides of what? What's in the middle here? In the middle here, we have the person. We have the gever. We have tov la gever, right? He is kind of buffered by this belief in God's compassion, in God's kindness, and then he's able to find himself. Right? There's no God in the middle of the book. In the middle of the book, it's the gever finding his own ability to almost embrace the crisis and to emerge a stronger, better, more well-formed person. But it's just him and him alone in the middle.
But how does he do that? You write in the deepest recesses of the book, the middle of the middle, as you just expressed. The Gever expresses faith in humankind and in himself, as opposed to the section surrounding, where it was more his expression of faith in God, as you said. And you write, and this is certainly reflected in your book subtitle, that calamity need not destroy one's convictions, serving instead as a conduit to discovering them. Adversity can foster faith in a turbulent world. So how is that done? How does he do that? How should we do that?
Yeah. Yeah, there was a double entendre in that subtitle, right? Faith while you're in a turbulent world, and faith in the turbulent world, which is what you're asking about, which is, I think, really what we find here at the middle. So in these middle verses, okay, we see a lot of language that previously appeared to describe suffering. I'll give you the best example. The best example is, I think, one of the best known phrases in the book is the phrase that we open the book with, right? Eikha yashava vadad ha'ir rabati am hayata ke'almana. How has the city sat lonely, right? That city that was once so filled with people, the city that was teeming with life, is now sitting lonely like a widow. Yashva vadad. And so when I open the book, I realized that the thing that Eikha is crying about, is mourning, is drawing our attention to at the very beginning, is the loneliness of Jerusalem. I didn't mention this, by the way, at the beginning, but I think one of the experiences in Eikha that has become for me most poignant today is that sense of loneliness in the world, right? What we are experiencing vis-a-vis the broader world. And certainly when we open the book, that is a cause for suffering and for mourning. But when you get to the middle of the book, what does the middle of the book tell us? Tov lagever ki yisa o b'ne'urav. It is good for the man when he bears a burden in his youth. What are the next words? Yeshev badad v'yidom ki natal alav. He should sit alone and be silent when it is placed upon him. So I don't think that Eikha is in the business of telling us exactly the formula for each of us emerging from suffering. But I think it is saying something that is very universal in general, which is that if you embrace the crisis and you allow it to become part of who you are, then it will emerge in a way that both strengthens you and shapes you and enables you to reacquire your relationship with God, your relationship with the people around you, your faith in a new way, right? That's faith in a turbulent world. So we have here in the middle, I think, not specific advice, not pragmatic advice of exactly how you're going to emerge, but the notion that you can and you must search for the tov in your life and through the experience of crisis, right? Which I think is a much more complex message and one that I think enables everybody to read this chapter and figure out how to do it in their own way.
I want to return to the topic of theodicy that you mentioned before, or explaining how a good God can allow evil. And you write that philosophical attempts to resolve the mystery of God's providence inevitably fail. Instead, the sufferer has only one recourse, and that's to turn inward and consider how those events can produce change. And you use this idea to explain perhaps the most familiar pasuk in Perek Gimel, Nechbasa derechina v'nachkora v'nashuva ad Hashem, right? Let us search and try our ways and return to God. And you encourage that while humans can never comprehend God's designs, we can control our own responses. And therefore, the critical question is not a helpless, why has this happened, but rather the practical, what can each individual do in the wake of suffering, or more constructive, as you write, response to their travails. Now, this reminded me very much of Rav Soloveitchik, what he writes in Kol Dudi Dofek. And it's very similar to what Rabbi Sacks writes also with regard to responding to suffering. And they both argue, don't ask the metaphysical why question, but rather the pragmatic how question. How should I respond to suffering most constructively? How can I find or make the most meaning out of my suffering? So how does the Megillah, even if it's individualized for each reader, how does the Megillah answer that question?
Yeah, well, I'm certain, not certain, but I'm pretty sure that I quoted Rev Soloveitchik there because I really do think I was deeply influenced by Rev Soloveitchik's approach certainly in this regard. Look, there's something that happens to the Gever after he emerges from his theological reflections that is absolutely life changing for him. And I think it relates to this question of not asking, how could you do this, God? But what does this demand of me? Several interesting things happen here. First of all, for the first time in the Megillah, a new person, a new speaker emerges. The Megillah kind of shifts between different speakers. Sometimes we have first person singular, sometimes we have third person objective. We have kind of the objective narrator telling the story of Jerusalem's suffering. Well, immediately after the reflections, for the first time, we have the first person plural. We have the we, right? And it seems as though the Gever has kind of linked into the community. Now that's very interesting, especially because at the beginning of his journey, he in Pasuk Yud Daled, he very much feels, I think, alienated from the people, right? He says, "Haiti schok lechol ami niginatam kol hayom." I was a laughing stock to my people. I was their plaything, right? They didn't treat me well. They didn't take me seriously, and he's very, very alone, right? There's something almost narcissistic about his aloneness at the beginning of the chapter. Ani hagever, right? Ach bi yashuv. Oti nahag. He's very, very focused on himself, which I'm not necessarily saying as a criticism. I think that is oftentimes the way that people who are experiencing suffering have to cope with that suffering is by perhaps in the first stage focusing inward. But when he emerges from these reflections, he emerges a new person. He is a person that isn't just a member of the community, but he wants to be a member of the community. And to what end? First of all, to help the community. He rallies the community together to do tshuva, to repent, to return to God. He says, "Nachpesa drachenu v'nachkora v'nashuva el Hashem." Right? He suddenly becomes this, this figure who feels that he has a responsibility towards the community. He has learned a lot, not just about himself, but about his role in the world, and also I think how he can use his crisis to better the world, to better the lives of others. Now, I'll say two other things, one of which is that when the first person singular returns, right, before he goes back to his own suffering, which he is going to go back to at the end of the chapter, and that indicates to us that it's not as though something external has changed in his life. He's still in the throes of suffering. His internals have changed. That introspection, that sitting down and deeply, engaging and looking inward has changed him. But his suffering remains the same. But before he goes back to his suffering, in I believe verse 48, he says as follows. He says, "Palgei maim terad eni al shever bat ami." He says, "Streams of water come out of my eyes because of the brokenness of my people. My eyes cry, they won't stop. Ad yashkif Hashem shamayim." He plays a Choni Amagel here, or Choni Amagel plays him, right? He says, "I will not stop crying until God sees." Right? He becomes not just someone who rallies his people to tshuva, but someone who becomes an advocate of his people. Right. And I'll just say one more thing that I think that is really significant and changes here. We're really talking about how he finds his role in the community. He finds his footing, vis-a-vis others. How can he use his crisis to help others, to rally others, to advocate for others? But the other thing that he really finds is God, right? This whole journey of starting with the ani, when he describes his prayer in verse 8, he describes his prayer in the Gimel verses, okay? It's the middle one of the Gimel verses. And those verses are surrounded by the word by two other Gimels, right? Both of which start with the word gader. right? There's a fence around verse 8. And what happens in verse 8? He describes his failed prayer. He says, Gam ki ezak va'ashavea satam tefilati. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is blocked. Okay. But why is his prayer blocked? I think it's pretty self-evident because in that verse, there is only an I. There is no thou. Gam ki ezak va'ashavea satam tefilati. He can't even find God because he cannot look outside of himself long enough to see another, not to see another human, not to see another, not to see God. So he's praying, but his prayer is stuck because he can only see himself. In verse 44, after he emerges from his reflections, he says to God, he has the same complaint. He says, God, my prayer is not working. But how does he describe it? He says, Sakota ve'anan lach me'avor tefillah. You covered yourself with a cloud from allowing prayer to enter. In other words, he's saying now, his prayer gets almost to God, but God doesn't allow it to enter, right? So he's really changed this sufferer because he's taken it as his mandate to change. He sees it as it's my personal responsibility because of what I've grown through and because of the growth that I've experienced to use that to create new things in my personal life and in the world.
One final question. Tisha B'Av is over for you in Israel. We're past Chatzot here in the US and the Eastern time zone at least. And as we look beyond Tisha B'Av, can you leave us with an understanding of how Eikha interplays with the Pirkei Nechama and Yeshayahu that make up the Sheva Denechemta, the next 7 Haftarot on the next 7 Shabbatot, that enable us to move away from today, from Tisha B'Av, from the suffering, from the mourning, from the past catastrophes, towards Rosh Hashanah?
Yeah, this is really my favorite question, partially because I don't really have the personality to be too long in Eikha. I know I spent many years writing on it, but I think that there's the questions that I'm really looking for are the questions of what now, right? Beyond Eikha and how Eikha, I think really almost becomes a bridge to the next period. But what you said in terms of the way that we experience Eikha every year, I think is extraordinarily important because every year we experience Tisha B'Av. It's a very difficult day, right? We're fasting, but we're also mourning, as we said at the beginning, not just ancient events, but contemporary events, and we're trying to understand how to cope with God in the midst of suffering. And when we emerge from Tisha B'Av, we emerge to 7 wonderful haftarot that we read in shul every week, right? And they're called the Sheva Denechemta. They are the 7 haftarot of consolation, and that leads us to Rosh Hashanah. And this experience, I think, if you kind of take a step back and you understand it, you understand that that's what it's designed to do. Those haftarot represent the yearly journey that we make as we kind of get up off the ground from Tisha B'Av and stand before God to coronate God on the Rosh Hashanah holiday. So how does that happen? The answer is really the Sheva Denechemta, those chapters in Isaiah, which are all part of the final 27 chapters of Isaiah. Those 27 chapters are called the Pirkei Nechama. They are the chapters of consolation. Their subject is the reversal of Eikha, right? Because what is their subject? Their subject is the prophet is calling to the people in the Babylonian exile, those who were exiled as a result of the catastrophic events of the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 586 BCE, that which we're talking about in Eikha. And these chapters in Isaiah are calling the exilees to come home. And in doing so, they are reversing Megillat Eikha. I'll give you a couple examples, okay? So one of the things that we know in Megillat Eikha, and I think it's an important part of the Tisha B'Av experience, is that it's not a very hopeful book. It's not filled with consolation, and it's not supposed to be. I mean, I think this is part of what Eikha teaches us. It teaches us that there's a time to mourn, right? At least both. There's a time to mourn and to sit and in our pain. One, I think, good indication of the fact that there's no consolation in Eikha, aside from the fact that the final verse in Eikha is actually not the verse that we repeat, right? Not the hopeful Hashivenu Hashem Elecha v'nashuv v'chadesh yameinu kekedem. Restore us to you, God, and we will return. Renew our days as days of old. But the last verse in Eikha is Ki im ma'os me'astanu katsafta aleinu ad me'od. For you, God, have surely rejected us. You have been excessively wrathful with us. That's a bad verse to end with. That's why we repeat the second to last verse in while we're hearing Eikha in shul. But the other indication of the kind of absence of consolation is the word nacham, nechama, which appears 6 times in Megillat Eikha. Sometimes when I ask people, does that word appear in Eikha? They say, oh, no, it couldn't possibly appear, which is a good guess, right? But it does. It appears 6 times. 5 times in the first chapter. How does it appear in the first chapter? Ein la menachem, ein menachem li, rachak mimeni menachem, right? I have no consoler. I have no comforter. Comfort is far from me. And it appears once in chapter 2 as a rhetorical question, ma anachamech. What could I possibly comfort you with, right? There's no consolation in Eikha. Now, of course, the chapters of Isaiah start with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu, Ami. Right? That's what we're going to read next Shabbat. Comfort my people. You need to start with consolation. And then the word Nacham is sort of strewn throughout those chapters. And in the final chapter, we actually have a verse, the final chapter of Isaiah, of the prophecies of Isaiah. We actually have a verse that repeats the word Nechama 3 times in rapid succession. So it kind of frames those chapters. So, we're reacquiring hope. There are also, I think, some very, very specific things that happen as we're reading the prophecies of consolation, the Sheva de Nechemta, that are there to reverse Eikha. I'll mention I'll mention 1 or 2 of them. You can tell me when we no longer have time, but I'll mention one or 2 of them. One is that, as when Eikha ends, it ends really with a kind of a rhetorical question by the people, where the people turn to God and say, Lama lanetzach, Lama lanetzach tishkachenu ta'azvenu la'orech yamim, right? Why, God? Why would you forget us forever? Why would you forsake us for the length of days? And it's kind of like a question that trails off. There's no answer to the question. It's just a heartrending why. Why would you forget us? Why would you forsake us? Now, there are only 2 places in all of Tanakh that those 2 verbs appear in succession to describe God. Shachach and azav, forgot and forsook. And it's in the second prophecy of consolation, in Yeshayahu, I think it's the second, Yeshayahu chapter 49, where the prophecy begins that we're going to read, I think 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now, we're going to read a prophecy that begins with Jerusalem speaking, Vatomer Tzion, Azavani Hashem, v'Hashem shchechani. Tzion said, God forgot me, God forsook me. So it sounds a lot like the continuation of Eikha. And at that point in Isaiah, in Isaiah, the people have not yet returned to Jerusalem. They're still in exile. But here's the difference. The next pasuk is God's answer. God says, Hatishkach isha ula merachem ben bitna, gam eila tishkachna ve'anochi lo ashkachech. Ne'um Hashem, right? God says, can a woman forget her child? Can she stop having compassion on the fruit of her womb? And even if she could, I would never forget you, says God. So there are all these, I think, very specific moments. We don't really have time to go into it. Maybe we'll leave that for another occasion. But there are all these specific moments, and they're really laced into the language of the prophecies that we're going to be reading in the next 7 haftarahs, which really seem to take a lot of different topics that leave us either hanging or kind of gloomy or downright miserable in Eikha. And when we make our way through the haftarot, they kind of one by one lead us away from those, from those really, I think, very difficult situations that we find ourselves. I'll maybe close this point with one final thought, which is that in chapter 2 in Eikha, we have the elders sitting on the ground. They're putting dust on their head. They're rolling in the dust, and they're wearing sackcloth, and they're just mourning, and almost as though they already are mourning their own demise, right? They're rolling in the dust. They're waiting to be buried, and in the fourth chapter, the fourth of the haftarot of Nechama, is where Isaiah turns to the people and says, "Kumi." Oh, Uri, right? Uri. Oh no, I can't remember the words where he says, "Get up, dust off your clothes," right?
You can just paraphrase.
Oh no, I don't like paraphrasing. Uri, leave shiuzech Tzion, right? Where he says, oh, I know what I wanted. I know the pasuk I was looking for. Hina'ari. It's what we say in L'chadodi. Me'afar kumi, right? Get up, shake off the dust, put on your clothes of glory, and start to walk forward again with dignity and with vibrancy and with a renewed sense of purpose. And that will take you from Tisha B'Av to Rosh Hashanah.
Thank you so much, Yael, for really providing so much insight and deepening the meaning of not only Megillat Eikha, but also the Shabbat Nechemta that we will be reading over the next 7 Shabbatot. I very much appreciate you joining me today, and thank you all for joining us. This is the fourth of our series that have run over the course of the 3 weeks, and we look forward to seeing you at future Sacks-Herenstein programs in the fall. Take care.